Greetings. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Aviation Weather Outlook on this Wednesday, November 6, 2024. And as of this Wednesday late morning, we have an area of low pressure that's come up toward Kuskokwim Bay, and that feature is just going to gradually weaken as yet. Another low will be lifting out of the North Pacific and passing just south and on the east side of Kodiak Island as we round up through the end of the week into the early weekend, and this low is just going to kind of pull up into the western Gulf. That's going to force another frontal system up along areas of the Gulf Coast. By the time we get into this late Wednesday evening, overnight period into early Thursday morning, there'll be a break in the precipitation over the Panhandle, but then another push of coastal rains with some moderate to heavy snowfall in the coastal mountains along areas of the northern, northeastern Gulf Coast and Panhandle as we go through Thursday and Friday. We expect IFR conditions along stretches, especially west arm of the Alaska Range up along areas of the Kenai, Chugach Mountains. And we also have IFR conditions due to blowing snow, lower ceilings here along areas of the Arctic coast, even though the current winter storm warnings and winter weather advisories for light snow and blowing snow creating reduced visibility will be tending to let up this Wednesday night. Still some lingering areas of lower visibility and ceilings here along areas of the Arctic coast Thursday morning, and then off of the west coast, especially along the lower Yukon Delta, Nunavik Island, from St. Lawrence down to St. Matthew and St. Paul. We'll see IFR conditions on Thursday afternoon. This trough that's kind of rotating back out to the west along this, there will be IFR conditions with those lower ceilings. Improving weather across much of the mainland, generally VFR conditions for the interior. Still areas of IFR between Utqiagvik and Kaktovik due to some lower visibilities and remaining some blowing snow. Panhandle, some MVFR conditions, intercoastal mountains up through the northern parts of the Panhandle, including Chilkoot and White Pass. And then for Friday morning, we find with that frontal system, the low out here in the Gulf, along the frontal system, there'll be additional light to moderate precipitation, maybe a few areas of locally heavy, but generally some moderate precipitation along the coast with MVFR conditions. As we go to the far north, still some lingering IFR conditions around Kaktovik, and then out here over the eastern Bering, we anticipate widespread IFR conditions from just south there of the Bering Strait all the way down to the north side of the Alaska Peninsula, and into Friday afternoon we find some areas of IFR, especially up through the mountains outside of Juneau and up toward Haines and Skagway. Otherwise, MVFR across a fair portion of the Panhandle out in the northeastern Gulf Coast with IFR conditions west side of Prince William Sound, the eastern portion of the Kenai Peninsula, and then back out here to areas along the west side of Cook Inlet, coming through just to the east and northeast of Lake Iliamna, and then out over, again, persisting areas of IFR out over the eastern and northern Bering, and still IFR conditions there along the Arctic coast. So pass conditions for Thursday, we anticipate Anaktuvik Pass to be VFR on Thursday, as will Adigan Pass, because generally just high pressure in place over the interior with some rather chilly temperatures. Those pass areas have seen consistently now low temperatures below zero at night. Now along areas of the Alaska Range, starting out west arm there with some IFR conditions, Lake Clark and Merrill becoming MVFR as we go through the day. Rainy Pass, IFR becoming MVFR for Thursday, and then rounding up along Windy Pass, IFR conditions becoming VFR. And as we go further east along the Alaska Range, we have Isabel and Mentasta passes, generally VFR conditions prevailing throughout the day. Thursday, dropping south, VFR, Tanita Pass, Portage Pass, especially the east side out there over western Prince William Sound, starting IFR, becoming MVFR. And then up in the northern Panhandle, Chilkoot and White will see VFR conditions early Thursday give way to MVFR conditions. And looking at freezing levels at the surface, we do find readings generally above freezing along the Gulf Coast and areas of Cook Inlet into portions of the southwest coast. Freezing levels aloft are highest south of the Panhandle and off of British Columbia. Freezing levels rise 6,000 feet over the Panhandle, 8,000 feet there, plus over Haida Gwaii. and that is just kind of an indicator of where the front in that warmer air aloft is located. The greatest risk for some icing will be with this next low coming up out of the North Pacific, as there's another frontal band that'll be working its way up to along the Gulf Coast, pushing into the Panhandle. But before then, freezing levels still high, above 8,000 feet, some moderate icing, southern Panhandle, especially around Ketchikan toward Hyder. Back up along the northern Gulf Coast, western Gulf Coast, above 6,000 feet. And then 4,000 feet, we could find some moderate icing. Areas of the southwest interior, Bristol Bay into across portions of the Alaska Range, and also an area up toward the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, we could find some moderate icing above 4,000 feet. So the jet stream pattern, 30,000 feet, clearly shows a strong jet core upwards of 150 to 160 knots. Southwest flow coming in there across the lower Panhandle, Haida Gwaii into western British Columbia. Broad circulation. We have generally a broad trough here out over the eastern Bering. And as we drop down to 9,000 feet, or roughly 700 millibars, we see a clear circulation right around and east of Kodiak Island over the western Gulf. Ahead of it, a broad southwesterly flow between 40 and 60 knots. Strongest winds coming onshore into western Canada, intercoastal mountains of the Panhandle, British Columbia coast, a number of winds upwards of 65 knots as a result of that system. And then at 3,000 feet, we have the low circulation around Kodiak Island and the western Gulf, with the strongest winds, at least in lower levels, 3,000 feet above the surface, generally to the south of the low circulation, pulling out of the North Pacific, rotating up into the lower Gulf. Of note, to the north, we still have brisk winds easterly, polar easterlies, because of the high pressure that's up in the Arctic Ocean. We find winds 30, 40 knots along the Arctic coast, keeping some of that blowing snow and lower visibilities going. And then across the central Bering and the eastern Aleutians and lower half of the Alaska Peninsula, pretty steady northwesterly winds, 35 to 40 knots. So as a result, you guessed it, the greatest threat for widespread moderate turbulence will exist starting here along the Panhandle, surface to 6,000 feet for Thursday. And then as we ride along the western Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, the Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet, down through Kodiak Island, the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, there's that potential for moderate turbulence, surface to 4,000 feet. To a lesser extent, we find some turbulence in through the southwest interior, especially on the west side of the Alaska Range, and then perhaps a little isolated moderate turbulence along areas of the Arctic coast where those brisk easterlies continue, surface to 3,000 feet.